My name is Drusilla Mabel. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as someone's wife before I was ever known as myself. I live in a city where ambition is worn like fragrance, subtle, expensive, and constantly competing for attention. I work in a field that rewards composure and long memory. I am trained to notice patterns, to listen when others speak, to document what most people forget 5 minutes later. But in my marriage, I was something else entirely. To friends, I was the steady one. To my husband, I was the practical one. To his family, I was lucky. Lucky to have him, lucky he chose me, lucky he handled the big decisions. People often underestimate quiet women. They confuse composure with compliance. They assume that because we do not argue, we do not calculate, because we do not interrupt, we do not understand. My husband once told me, not unkindly, just confidently, that divorce between us was inevitable. He said it the way someone comments on the weather, a forecast, not a threat, and he expected me to react the way I always had, gently, emotionally, perhaps even fearfully. What he did not expect was that I would reach into my leather portfolio, remove a document we both signed years earlier, and place it quietly between us on the table. The prenup, the agreement he insisted on, the one he believed protected him. That moment wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no tears, no overturned chairs or cinematic speeches, just paper and silence. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation. And it certainly isn't about sudden empowerment or miraculous twists of fate. It's about something much slower, much quieter. It's about what happens when a woman stops absorbing dismissal and starts documenting it. It's about understanding leverage long before anyone realizes you have it. It's about using the rules someone else wrote without ever raising your voice. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly how I went from being the predictable wife to the one variable he never calculated. Not with anger, not with drama, but with clarity. Have you ever been underestimated so consistently that you almost began to believe it yourself? If you asked anyone in our circle to describe me 5 years ago, they would have smiled politely before answering. Drusilla? She's brilliant but very reserved. She's not really into the spotlight. She balances him out. That last one was my husband's favorite. I was the balance, the stabilizer, the quiet counterweight to his charisma. My husband, Daniel, was magnetic in rooms full of glass and steel. He worked in private equity, the kind of career that teaches you to speak in forecasts and exit strategies. He had a way of leaning back in his chair during negotiations, fingers steepled, as if the outcome was already decided, and he was simply allowing others to catch up to it. And beside him I sat in tailored neutrals, listening. At dinner parties in Chicago's West Loop, conversations orbited him. Markets, startups, venture rounds. I could have contributed. I often had more context than most of the men at the table, but I learned early that my restraint made him more comfortable. He liked being the authority. I liked observing the authority. It was never explicitly said, but roles formed like sediment in water. Daniel was the visionary. I was the processor. When friends needed advice about investments, they called him. When they needed help understanding contracts, they texted me quietly afterward. I became the person people trusted in private but deferred to in public. At family gatherings, his mother would pat my hand and say, "It's wonderful that you support Daniel's ambitions. Not every woman can step back like that." Step back. The phrase stayed with me, as if my career, a senior corporate risk analyst for a multinational firm, was some hobby I indulged in between packing his suitcases. As if my ability to interpret liability clauses, anticipate regulatory exposure, and map financial vulnerability wasn't a profession that required precision and stamina. But I didn't correct anyone, because correction requires confrontation. And confrontation in our marriage always carried a cost. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't belittle me outright. His dismissals were softer than that. He would say, "You're overthinking it," or "That's not how this level works." Or my favorite, delivered with a faint smile, "That's cute, Drew." Cute. I learned to compress my responses into something socially acceptable. A nod, a small smile, a sip of wine. In truth, I wasn't silent because I lacked confidence. I was silent because I was measuring. I noticed how Daniel handled joint accounts, which ones he considered ours, and which ones he subtly referred to as mine. I noticed how often he spoke about future exits and liquidity events as if they were solo achievements, even when my income stabilized in our early years. I noticed patterns in language. In risk analysis, patterns matter more than moments. But to everyone else, I was simply steady, predictable, supportive, the woman who never caused a scene. There is a particular kind of invisibility reserved for competent women married to confident men. It's not erasure. It's soft blurring. You're present, but slightly out of focus. Daniel once told a colleague in front of me, Drew prefers staying out of the financial complexity. She trusts me with that. I didn't correct him. Not because it was true, but because I was still studying the architecture of our marriage. At that time, I believed patience was loyalty. I believed understanding was strength. And perhaps it was, just not in the way he assumed. To them, I was the calm wife who would adapt to any forecast. They never asked whether I was drafting one of my own. The first small cut did not look like betrayal. It looked like a celebration. Daniel had just closed a significant deal, the kind that earns applause in glass conference rooms and congratulatory texts past midnight. He invited a handful of colleagues to a private dinner downtown. It was one of those restaurants where the lighting flatters ambition and the menus don't list prices. I wore navy silk and a simple gold cuff, structured, neutral, predictable. Halfway through the evening, one of his junior associates asked how Daniel had navigated the early funding years. It was a genuine question. Curious, admiring. Daniel laughed lightly and leaned back. Oh, those years were tight, he said. I was basically carrying everything myself. Took a lot of pressure. I felt it then. Not anger, just a quiet shift in temperature. Because during those tight years, my salary had covered our mortgage. My benefits had carried our health insurance. My bonuses had closed liquidity gaps he didn't want investors to see. But the story he told was cleaner without me in it. The table nodded sympathetically. Glasses clinked. I smiled. One of the wives turned to me and said warmly, "It must have been hard watching him take on so much." Watching. There it was again, the subtle reassignment of authorship. I considered correcting the narrative. I could have said, Iki, actually, we structured our risk exposure jointly. Or, my income stabilized in our first 2 years. But correction would have changed the tone of the night. It would have introduced friction where admiration currently flowed. Daniel caught my eye across the table. His expression wasn't malicious. It was confident, secure in the assumption that I would not disrupt the storyline. And I didn't. Instead, I filed it away. Not as a grievance, as data. On the drive home, he was energized, replaying compliments, dissecting investor reactions. "Good night, right?" he said, one hand on the wheel. "It was," I replied. He didn't notice the absence in my voice, or perhaps he did and categorized it as fatigue. When we reached our building, he added casually, "You don't mind that I simplify the early years when I tell it, do you? It's just easier than explaining the whole dynamic." Simplify. That word is dangerous in relationships. Simplifying a story often means removing the person who complicates the hero narrative. I paused before answering. "No," I said evenly, "I don't mind." And in that moment, I told the truth. I didn't mind the storytelling. I minded the assumption. It was the first time I realized something subtle but important. Daniel didn't see me as a co-architect. He saw me as a stabilizing feature of the environment, like interest rates or overhead. Necessary, but not credited. That night, while he slept, I opened my laptop and reviewed our shared financial folders. Not because I suspected betrayal. Not because I was planning anything, but because something in me had shifted from emotional processing to structural awareness. In my profession, when a company misrepresents internal contributions, it's rarely about ego. It's about power consolidation. I wasn't hurt. I was recalibrating. Small cuts don't bleed loudly. They simply reveal where the skin is thin. And I began to wonder, if he could simplify our past so easily in conversation, how easily could he simplify it on paper? The thing about small cuts is that you can convince yourself they're accidents. You tell yourself he didn't mean it that way. You tell yourself the timing wasn't right. You tell yourself you're being sensitive. And if you are already known as the measured one, the analytical one, you become especially careful not to appear emotional. So I normalized it. Daniel continued to narrate our life in a way that placed him at the center and me at the perimeter. It wasn't overtly cruel. It was structural. When we refinanced our home, he told the broker, "I'll handle the negotiations. Drew doesn't enjoy this stuff. I work in risk assessment. Negotiation is oxygen to me." But I smiled politely and allowed him to speak. At social gatherings, if someone asked about my work, Daniel would interject before I finished answering. She deals with compliance and paperwork, very detail-oriented. Compliance and paperwork. That's like describing architecture as drawing lines. Each time it was subtle enough to dismiss. Each time I dismissed it. I told myself marriage required fluid roles. I told myself ego wasn't worth conflict. I told myself love meant generosity with credit. And to be fair, Daniel wasn't a monster. He was attentive in certain ways. He remembered my coffee order. He sent flowers on promotion days. He introduced me as brilliant, but always with an undertone that brilliance was an accessory to his larger narrative. The dynamic became routine. He would speak broadly. I would refine privately. He would take strategic risks. I would quietly calculate their downside. If an investment underperformed, he would sigh and say, "We'll absorb it." And I would already have adjusted projections in a spreadsheet he'd never seen. The normalization didn't happen all at once. It happened through repetition. Language shapes identity. When someone repeatedly positions you as supportive rather than central, you begin to occupy that role more fully. Not because you believe it, but because fighting every mischaracterization becomes exhausting. There was a moment at a charity gala that crystallized this pattern. Daniel was on stage discussing entrepreneurial resilience. The moderator asked him what sustained him during volatile periods. He smiled into the microphone and said, "Honestly, believing in myself. You have to trust your instincts." The audience applauded. I clapped too. But I remembered the night 3 years earlier when he had sat at our kitchen table, spreadsheets open, panic barely concealed. I had walked him through liquidity contingencies, modeled 3 exit scenarios, and suggested restructuring exposure before the downturn deepened. He had followed that advice. But on stage, instinct made for a better story than collaboration. Later in the car, I said gently, "You didn't mention that we adjusted strategy together." He glanced at me, surprised. "It was a keynote, Drew. It's not a board meeting." There it was again. The implication that nuance belonged in private, while narrative belonged to him. I nodded, and something inside me began to separate. Not emotionally, structurally. I stopped assuming that fairness would emerge organically. In risk analysis, if a pattern repeats without correction, it becomes policy. I realized that my silence was no longer patience. It was participation, but I still wasn't ready to confront it. Not outwardly. Instead, I did what I've always done best. I observed. I documented. And I began asking myself a quieter question. If he genuinely believed I was peripheral, what would happen if one day I wasn't there to stabilize the margins? There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize the role you've been cast in. Not the role you chose, not the role you consciously accepted. The one that formed around you like scaffolding until you could no longer see the structure because you were standing inside it. For me, that realization came quietly on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel was in his home office, door half closed, discussing an acquisition with a partner. His voice carried into the hallway. Controlled, confident, persuasive. I was in the kitchen, reviewing our quarterly household expenses, not because anyone asked me to, because I always had. He stepped out mid-call and handed me a notepad. "Can you check if we have enough liquidity in the joint account to cover the bridge payment, just in case?" Just in case. He returned to his call before I answered. That small interaction told me everything. In public, he handled strategy. In private, I handled contingencies. I wasn't the decision maker, I was the safety net. Later that evening, we hosted 2 of his colleagues and their spouses for dinner. I prepared the meal. Not because he demanded it, but because somewhere along the way it became assumed that I would ensure everything ran smoothly. I plated the food while they debated market forecasts at the table. When one of the guests asked about a regulatory risk tied to Daniel's new investment, he waved it off lightly. "We're comfortable with the exposure." I nearly smiled at the word. "We." After dessert, one of the wives lingered in the kitchen with me. She glanced toward the dining room and said, almost sympathetically, "You must be proud of him. It takes a certain kind of woman to support a man like that." Support. Again. Not a partner, not a strategist. Support. That night, lying beside Daniel, I stared at the ceiling longer than usual. It wasn't anger that kept me awake. It was clarity. I had been assigned 3 invisible functions: emotional regulator, financial stabilizer, social harmonizer. Reliable, useful, invisible. I realized something uncomfortable. I had made it easy. My competence removed friction from his life. My discretion removed competition. My calm removed the threat. He wasn't intentionally diminishing me. He had simply grown accustomed to a system that benefited him. And systems, once established, resist change. The following week, he forwarded me a draft of a new investment structure and wrote, "Take a quick look, just sanity check." Sanity check. As if my expertise were a courtesy. I reviewed it thoroughly, as always. I flagged vulnerabilities, suggested revisions, adjusted exposure modeling. He implemented every change. But at the next gathering, he described the structure as something he reworked over the weekend. I watched him speak, and for the first time, I didn't feel overlooked. I felt repositioned, like an internal consultant whose contributions were essential but never acknowledged. That was the role I had been assigned. And the most unsettling part, no one had forced it on me. I had allowed it because I believed harmony was strength. But harmony without recognition isn't partnership, it's background music. That Sunday afternoon in the hallway, holding his notepad, I understood something fundamental. He trusted my competence completely. He just didn't respect its authorship. And that distinction would matter more than either of us realized. The shift did not happen during an argument. It didn't happen after betrayal. There was no discovery of secret accounts, no late-night confession. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Daniel and I were having breakfast in silence. Not tense silence, just routine quiet. He was scrolling through market updates on his tablet. I was reviewing quarterly projections for a client. Without looking up, he said, almost conversationally, "I've been thinking." That phrase used to make me lean in. It used to signal collaboration. This time it sounded different. "I don't see us being long-term," he continued. "Not in a bad way, just realistically. Divorce is probably inevitable at some point." He said it the way someone might say, "We'll probably move neighborhoods in 5 years." Forecasting. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. He finally looked at me, measuring my reaction. "I mean," he added, "we're both ambitious. People evolve. It's not personal." Not personal. As if a marriage were a joint venture with a scheduled exit strategy. I waited for the familiar surge, the impulse to defend, to ask questions, to negotiate emotionally. It didn't come. Instead, something quiet and precise moved through me. Clarity. Not about divorce, about positioning. I realized in that moment that Daniel was already narrating a future where I was transitional. A stabilizing phase, a useful chapter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dissatisfied in the dramatic sense. He simply believed he would eventually outgrow the structure of us, and that I would absorb that outcome gracefully. He had already factored me into the depreciation schedule. I set my fork down carefully. "And when did you decide that?" I asked. He shrugged lightly. "I haven't decided. It's just realistic. You know how these things go." Yes, I did know how things go. In business, when someone predicts an inevitable separation, they are either preparing leverage or testing a reaction. I studied his face. There was no cruelty there. Only assumption. Assumption that I would be surprised. Assumption that I would be hurt. Assumption that I would fight to change the forecast. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Good to know," I said. And that was it. He seemed almost disappointed by my composure, as if he had expected resistance. Something to confirm his importance in the equation. But I gave him nothing reactive to work with. The shift wasn't about proving him wrong. It wasn't about saving the marriage or ending it. It was about realizing that he had already reframed our union as temporary, while benefiting fully from its stability, and something inside me adjusted accordingly. For years, I had operated under the assumption that we were building something permanent, even if imperfect. That morning, I accepted a different premise. If he believed divorce was inevitable, then I would treat inevitability as a scenario to model, not emotionally, structurally. I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, kissed his cheek before leaving for work, the same gesture as every other day. He smiled, reassured by routine, but inside a quiet recalibration had begun. Not panic, not heartbreak, preparation. That was the day something shifted, not in our marriage, in me. After that Tuesday morning, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't demand reassurance. I didn't initiate a dramatic conversation about commitment. Instead, I did something far more unsettling. I stopped reacting. There's a difference between silence born from fear and silence born from decision. Before, my quietness had been adaptive, an effort to preserve harmony. Now it was strategic. Daniel continued behaving exactly as he always had. He planned trips months in advance. He discussed future investments. He spoke about our 5-year trajectory in casual conversation with friends. But once you hear someone describe your marriage as inevitable divorce, every shared future begins to sound provisional. I began to listen differently. When he used the word ours, I tracked context. When he said my portfolio, I noted which assets he meant. When he transferred funds between accounts, I reviewed timestamps. Not obsessively, calmly, professionally. At dinner one night, he mentioned restructuring one of his holdings under a new LLC. It's cleaner, he said, more efficient. For tax purposes, I asked evenly. And flexibility, he replied. Flexibility. Another word that means different things depending on timing. He assumed I was simply curious. He didn't know I had started revisiting every financial document we had signed since our wedding, including the prenuptial agreement he once insisted upon. At the time, I hadn't resisted it. In fact, I had reviewed it thoroughly, made suggestions, negotiated terms quietly. He believed it protected him from risk. What he hadn't fully appreciated was that clarity in contracts protects both parties, especially the one who reads footnotes carefully. My silence during those weeks made him comfortable. He mistook my calm for passivity. My lack of emotional response became proof in his mind that I hadn't taken his inevitability comment seriously. But silence, when chosen, sharpens perception. I stopped volunteering insights about his business risks unless directly asked. I allowed him to make minor miscalculations without immediately correcting them. Not to sabotage, but to observe how he operated without my invisible adjustments. He grew slightly more stressed, not dramatically, just subtly. One evening he asked, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said, and I was. Because something important had happened, I no longer saw myself as a stabilizing feature of his life. I saw myself as an independent system temporarily intertwined with his. That shift altered everything. When someone believes you will always absorb impact, they grow careless with force. When they realize you might step aside, gravity changes. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't punish. I simply stopped cushioning. In meetings, he began calling me more often for input. "Quick sanity check?" he'd text. Sometimes I responded, sometimes I let him solve it himself. He began praising my expertise more openly at gatherings, as if sensing an imbalance, but I could feel the difference. He was adjusting to discomfort he couldn't quite name. Silence had become a mirror, and in that mirror he was starting to notice something unsettling. The system he relied on was no longer automatically correcting his risk. He still believed divorce was inevitable. What he didn't yet understand was that inevitability worked both ways. Preparation never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine, like someone updating spreadsheets at midnight, like quiet weekends spent catching up on work. Daniel never noticed when my preparation began in earnest because it didn't disrupt anything visible. If anything, I became more agreeable, more measured, less corrective. He interpreted that as stability returning. What he didn't understand was that I had begun separating emotion from structure entirely. The first thing I did was retrieve a physical copy of our prenuptial agreement from the fireproof safe in our hallway closet. I had reviewed it years ago, line by line. I knew its contours. But this time, I read it as if I were an external auditor. I marked clauses in pencil, cross-referenced asset schedules, noted timing conditions tied to the duration of marriage. Daniel had insisted on the prenup before our wedding, framing it as prudent. Standard at my level, he'd said. I hadn't objected. I understood risk mitigation. What I also understood, even then, was that contracts are only as powerful as the person who studies them. There were provisions tied to the appreciation of jointly acquired property, clauses regarding business growth during the marriage, language about liquidity events triggered after specific anniversaries, language he likely skimmed once and never revisited. I began documenting everything, not secretly, simply thoroughly. Quarterly account statements, LLC restructuring filings, capital contributions from joint funds, emails where he referenced our capital in writing. I wasn't building a case against him. I was building clarity for myself. There is a difference. At work, I was requested to lead a new project involving corporate exit strategy modeling. It gave me deeper exposure to valuation frameworks and asset shielding mechanisms. No one questioned my interest. It aligned with my expertise. Daniel even complimented the move. Smart pivot, he said. That's high-level stuff. Yes, it was. On weekends, while he played golf with partners, I reorganized our digital financial archives. Clean folders, time-stamped backups, redundant storage. If divorce was inevitable, as he so calmly predicted, then uncertainty was optional. I removed uncertainty. I also began meeting with my own financial advisor independently, someone outside our shared network. I framed it as long-term planning, retirement diversification, perfectly reasonable. He never asked for details. That was the thing about our marriage. He trusted my competence implicitly, as long as it operated in his favor. I also paid attention to subtler dynamics. When he spoke to friends about future investments, he increasingly used singular pronouns. My expansion, my next fund, my exit. The shift had already started in his language long before that Tuesday breakfast. I simply stopped pretending I hadn't noticed. One evening, while reviewing the prenup again, I reached a clause tied to business growth during the marriage exceeding a specified valuation threshold. It required the equitable division of certain appreciated assets if dissolution occurred after the 10-year mark. We were approaching that mark. The timing was precise. The clause wasn't hidden. It was simply technical, dense. The kind of language most people skim once and assume favors the wealthier spouse. I closed the folder slowly. No triumph, no excitement, just understanding. The shock he never saw coming would not be dramatic. It would be contractual. In the following weeks, Daniel grew slightly more attentive again, more affectionate, more inclusive in small decisions, as if subconsciously recalibrating. He still believed he was the strategist. He still believed I was a steady background infrastructure. He did not see the architecture shifting beneath him. Preparation is invisible until activated. And I was nearly ready. The moment of private revelation did not come with fireworks. It came with a spreadsheet. Daniel was in New York for a 3-day conference, presenting projections for his firm's newest fund. I knew the timeline well. I had helped him pressure test those projections months earlier, though my role in that process had never been publicly acknowledged. On the second night of his trip, I stayed late at my office under the soft hum of fluorescent lighting. The city outside was quiet, reflective. Chicago in winter has a way of forcing introspection. I opened 3 documents side by side: the original prenuptial agreement, the amended LLC operating agreement from his recent restructuring, the latest valuation summary from his firm's internal reporting, which he had once forwarded to our joint email thread without thinking twice. Individually, none of these documents was remarkable. Together, they told a story. The prenuptial agreement had a growth clause, one that triggered equitable distribution if business appreciation during the marriage surpassed a specific multiplier. It was framed as fair protection for jointly endured financial exposure. At the time of signing, Daniel's portfolio had been promising but not dominant. Now it had tripled in valuation. The LLC restructuring he implemented, the one he described as cleaner, did not exempt appreciation accumulated during the marriage. In fact, the language preserved spousal claim on growth derived from marital capital contributions. Marital capital contributions, which in our early years had come significantly from my income-stabilizing risk-heavy periods. He had assumed complexity shielded him. It didn't. It bound him. I recalculated everything independently. Conservative projections, aggressive projections, mid-range scenarios. No matter how I adjusted the model, the outcome remained consistent. If he initiated divorce after the 10-year mark, which we were months away from reaching, I was entitled to a portion of the growth he considered his exclusively. Substantial growth. The shock he never saw coming was not that I would fight him. It was that the agreement he insisted on had quietly positioned me far more securely than he realized. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. There was no thrill, no vindictive satisfaction, just stillness. For years, I had questioned whether my silence made me weak. Now I understand something different. Silence had allowed me to read everything clearly. He believed divorce was inevitable. What he hadn't considered was timing. In risk modeling, timing is leverage. If he waited too long, the clause strengthened my position. If he moved too early, optics and financial disclosures from his current fund launch would complicate everything. He was mid-expansion, mid-growth, mid-public narrative of success. The agreement tied his trajectory to mine more tightly than he understood. I printed the relevant pages, slid them into my black leather portfolio, the same one I carried to board meetings. Then I did something unexpected. I went home and made dinner as usual. When he called later that evening from his hotel room, energized from applause and investor interest, I listened calmly. "I think this fund is going to redefine things for me," he said. "For us," I replied softly. He didn't notice the difference in tone. He never noticed shifts in tone. That night, after we hung up, I placed the portfolio on my desk and rested my hand on it. Clarity changes posture. I wasn't preparing to ambush him. I was preparing to respond. And for the first time since that Tuesday breakfast, I felt something that resembled equilibrium. Not emotional balance, structural balance. The contract was no longer a symbol of distrust. It was architecture, and I knew exactly where the load-bearing beams were. Clarity presents options. Emotion demands reaction. Clarity demands choice. For several weeks after my private revelation, I did nothing visible. I continued working, continued attending dinners, continued being the composed wife who listened more than she spoke. Inside, however, I was evaluating paths. There were three. The first option was confrontation. I could sit Daniel down, present the clauses, and watch his expression change as he realized what the prenup truly meant. I could challenge his assumption that divorce was inevitable and renegotiate the psychological dynamic of our marriage in one decisive conversation. But confrontation would alert him, and alerted people to adjust their strategy quickly. The second option was preemption. I could initiate divorce myself, before the 10-year mark finalized certain provisions, before his next valuation cycle matured. It would be aggressive, controlled, clean, but it would also be reactive to his forecast, and I was no longer reacting. The third option was patience. Allow time to pass, allow growth to compound, allow the clause to mature fully. In risk management, the most powerful position is not the one that strikes first. It's the one that understands timing better than the other party. Daniel believed he controlled timing. He always had. He controlled when we invested, when we refinanced, when we traveled. Even when we discussed difficult topics, he introduced them casually as if scheduling emotional weather. If divorce was inevitable, he assumed he would decide when the forecast became action. The decision point for me was not about leaving. It was about reclaiming authorship of timing. One evening, as we walked along the river after dinner, he slipped his hand into mine absent-mindedly. "We're solid," he said, almost reassuring himself. "Whatever I said before about evolution, it's just realism. Doesn't mean I'm planning anything." Planning, that word echoed quietly. He thought planning was something he did alone. "I know," I replied gently, and I did know. He wasn't planning a divorce yet. He was simply preserving the psychological advantage of believing he could initiate it at will. That belief kept him comfortable, dominant, unquestioned. The decision I made that night was irreversible. Not legally, not yet, but internally. I decided I would not initiate. I would not warn. I would not renegotiate prematurely. I would allow the architecture to mature exactly as written. And when, not if, he returned to the conversation of inevitability, I would respond with documentation rather than emotion. I would use our financial agreement as the shock he never saw coming. Not to punish, not to humiliate, but to correct the narrative that I was transitional. If he believed I was temporary infrastructure, he would eventually discover I was a co-owner of the foundation. I tightened my coat against the wind and looked out at the skyline. Timing in both finance and marriage determines outcome. He thought inevitability gave him power. I understood that inevitability, properly timed, gave me equilibrium. And once I made that choice, something settled inside me. Not anger, authority. Once I chose patience, my actions became quieter, but more deliberate. From the outside, nothing changed. Inside, everything did. The first strategic move was administrative, almost invisible. I updated my personal financial accounts, not by draining joint funds or creating suspicion, but by ensuring my independent assets were liquid, diversified, and properly titled. I increased contributions to accounts in my name, rebalanced long-term investments, consolidated smaller holdings that had accumulated over the years. If a separation occurred, I wanted no dependency disguised as inconvenience. Daniel didn't question any of it. He rarely reviewed my accounts unless prompted. In his mind, financial authority was compartmentalized. He handled growth. I handled stability. I also scheduled a quiet consultation with a family law attorney, not to file anything, not to initiate proceedings, but to review the prenuptial agreement through an external lens. I framed it as a theoretical exercise. The attorney read carefully, asked precise questions, reviewed timelines. When she looked up, her expression was neutral but alert. "This agreement," she said, tapping one clause lightly, "is more balanced than most, especially at this valuation level." Valuation level. Hearing it from someone else confirmed what I already knew. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. Over the following months, I allowed Daniel to continue expanding his portfolio. His firm launched the new fund successfully. Media mentions increased. Investor confidence rose. At dinner parties, people spoke about his trajectory as if it were gravitational. I listened. Sometimes he would gesture toward me and say, "She keeps me grounded." Grounded. A word that implies weight without ownership. I smiled politely. Meanwhile, I tracked anniversary dates, contract maturity thresholds, liquidity events are scheduled for the upcoming fiscal year. The 10-year mark approached quietly. One evening, as we reviewed our calendar for the next quarter, Daniel mentioned casually, "We should plan something for our anniversary. A big one." "Yes," I replied evenly. "It is." He seemed pleased by my agreement. He did not see the significance beyond celebration. The week before that anniversary, I moved one final piece into place. I requested copies of updated valuation statements under the guise of long-term estate planning. He forwarded them without hesitation. Trust is powerful, especially when misdirected. Then, on the exact day our 10-year mark officially passed, I printed the updated statements and cross-referenced them with the clause tied to appreciation during the marriage. The numbers were clear. There was no ambiguity left. Daniel remained unaware of the threshold we had crossed. That was the difference between us. He thought in narratives. I thought in milestones. He believed inevitability was an emotional forecast. I understood it as a contractual timeline. I did not celebrate that day. I went to work, attended meetings, answered emails. But when I returned home and saw him at the kitchen counter discussing expansion plans on speakerphone, I observed him differently. He spoke about future exits confidently. He still believed he controlled when this story would pivot. What he didn't realize was that the pivot point had already been reached. Silence, when paired with timing, becomes architecture, and the structure was now fully built. The first consequence did not arrive as drama. It arrived as an absence. I began withdrawing something Daniel had never consciously recognized, my anticipatory corrections. When he drafted investor emails late at night, I no longer offered to review tone. When he sketched preliminary projections on the kitchen island, I didn't quietly adjust margin assumptions. When he rehearsed conference remarks aloud, I listened, but didn't refine phrasing. Not maliciously, simply neutrally. The effect was subtle at first. A misphrased comment during a panel discussion that required clarification the following day. An investor question he hadn't fully stress-tested. A short-term liquidity strain he resolved after a tense week rather than before. Nothing catastrophic. Just friction. He began working later hours again, the way he had in our early years. I noticed a slight tightness in his posture when he reviewed reports. He didn't ask directly for help, but his texts increased. Quick thought on this? Does this structure make sense? Gut check? Sometimes I replied the next morning instead of immediately. Sometimes I said, trust your instinct. He would pause when I said that. Instinct. The word he once used on stage to describe his success. He began speaking about our strategy more frequently in public settings, introducing me with longer descriptions of my expertise, inviting my opinion in front of others. But something had shifted permanently. Acknowledgement after invisibility feels different than partnership from the start. One evening after a particularly long day, he stood in the doorway of my home office. You've been distant, he said carefully. I've been focused, I replied. He nodded, unsure how to categorize that answer. The deeper consequence, though, was psychological. Daniel had always operated from a quiet confidence that our marriage, while imperfect, was stable terrain beneath him. He believed he could explore ambition without destabilizing home. Now, without understanding why, that stability felt less automatic. He sensed recalibration, but couldn't locate its source. During a dinner with close friends, someone joked about midlife divorces among high-performing couples. Daniel laughed. Too quickly. Not us, he said. We're solid. He glanced at me for confirmation. I held his gaze evenly. We are, I said. And in that moment, the statement was technically true. We were solid, contractually. The irony was almost mathematical. The more he felt subtle instability, the more he leaned into reassurance. More date nights, more public praise, more casual mentions of future plans. It wasn't guilt. It was a recalculation. He was trying to restore a dynamic that he didn't fully understand had shifted. But restoration requires knowing what was lost. And what he had lost was invisible labor. Emotional buffering, anticipatory risk management, quiet authorship. He began to feel loss without knowing its name. Not love, not commitment, control. He still believed that if divorce ever came, he would initiate it from a position of strength. He did not yet understand that strength had already redistributed. Consequences don't always look like explosions. Sometimes they look like gravity slowly changing direction, and gravity had begun to tilt. The second time Daniel said the word divorce, it wasn't theoretical. It was defensive. We were in the living room on a Thursday evening. A minor disagreement had unfolded. Nothing dramatic. A scheduling conflict. I missed dinner with one of my colleagues. Small things that, in healthy seasons, would have dissolved within minutes. But this time, irritation lingered. You've changed, he said finally, pacing near the window. You're not with me the way you used to be. With you? I asked calmly. You know what I mean. You used to be more involved, more supportive. Supportive. The word returned like an echo from years ago. I'm still here, I said evenly. That's not the same. His jaw tightened slightly. Sometimes I wonder if we're just delaying the inevitable. There it was again. Only this time the word didn't land as a prediction. It landed as frustration. He expected resistance, emotion, a plea to correct course. Instead, I studied him. Are you saying you want a divorce? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to reveal uncertainty. I'm saying maybe we should talk about it seriously, he replied. Seriously. Timing matters. We were now months past our 10th anniversary. His new fund was mid-cycle. Public visibility is at its peak. Valuations updated and documented. He thought he was reclaiming control of the narrative by introducing the possibility again. He didn't realize he was stepping into an architecture already completed. If that's what you want, I said gently, we can discuss it. My tone unsettled him more than anger would have. No one said I want it, he snapped lightly. You're making it binary. Binary. He was accustomed to holding options open. keeping leverage ambiguous. But ambiguity had an expiration date. "I'm not making anything," I replied. "I'm responding to what you're introducing." Silence stretched between us. For the first time, I saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Not dominance, not certainty. Calculation. He was reassessing variables he hadn't tracked. "If we did move in that direction," he said cautiously, "it would need to be clean. Fair. We have the prenup, obviously." Obviously. I felt the smallest shift in the air, the quiet click of inevitability aligning. "Yes," I said softly, "we do." He relaxed slightly at my agreement. He believed the prenup was his shield, his contingency plan. The document ensured his exit on his terms. "Then it wouldn't be complicated," he added. That word, uncomplicated, is often used by people who haven't reread their contracts recently. He moved toward the kitchen, perhaps to create physical distance from the conversation, perhaps to reestablish normalcy. I remained seated. Something about his posture told me he was expecting reassurance. Some sign that I would fight to keep him, to preserve the version of us where he held strategic advantage. Instead, I allowed silence to settle fully. Not cold, not hostile, final. He didn't know it yet, but it was too late to fix what he had miscalculated. Not because I wanted destruction, but because preparation, once complete, cannot be undone by late realization. You cannot unring structural awareness. He believed he was opening a door. In reality, he was walking toward a threshold already crossed. And soon he would understand that inevitability had never belonged solely to him. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon. Soft light filtered through the windows. The house was quiet, ordinary. I chose the dining table deliberately. Neutral territory, not the bedroom, not his office. Daniel sat across from me, composed but guarded. He had spent the past few days oscillating between distance and sudden warmth, as if recalibrating in real time. "I've been thinking," he began again. I almost smiled at the familiarity of the phrase. "So have I replied. He leaned back, folding his hands. "If we're going to talk about divorce, we should approach it rationally. No emotion, just logistics." Logistics. He believed that tone favored him. "I agree," I said. I reached beside me and placed my black leather portfolio gently on the table. His eyes flickered toward it, curious, not yet cautious. "I reviewed the prenup," he continued, unaware of what was coming. "It's straightforward. Separate property remains separate. Business interests are protected." "Some of them," I said calmly. I opened the portfolio and slid a small stack of printed pages toward him. Highlighted sections, updated valuations, cross-referenced clauses. He glanced down casually at first. Then he started reading more carefully. Silence filled the room, not tense, not explosive, just dense. His jaw shifted slightly as his eyes moved line by line. "That clause," he began, then stopped. "Yes," I said evenly. "The appreciation clause is tied to marital duration and growth thresholds." He looked up at me, searching my face for something: accusation, satisfaction, anger. He found none. "That was standard language," he said slowly. "It was negotiated language," I replied, "by both of us." He swallowed lightly. The numbers were clear. Growth during the marriage had exceeded the specified multiplier. The 10-year mark had passed. His recent fund valuation amplified the calculation further. "This changes the equation," he said quietly. "It clarifies it," I corrected. There was no shouting, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Just mathematics. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "I didn't realize—" "I know," I said, and I did. He hadn't realized because he hadn't needed to. He believed control of timing was his leverage. "You planned this," he said, not accusingly, more astonished. "I prepared," I replied. The distinction mattered. Preparation is not aggression. It is awareness applied early. "You're not upset," he observed carefully. "No," I said, "I'm informed." Another long pause. He looked at the documents again, recalculating mentally, assessing exposure, considering optics, timing, public perception. For the first time in our marriage, I could see him understanding that I was not background infrastructure. I was a co-architect. "What do you want?" he asked finally. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. I closed the portfolio slowly. "What I've always wanted," I said calmly. "Accuracy. No threat, no triumph. Just equilibrium." The confrontation ended not with an argument, but with silence heavy with recognition. He had forecasted inevitability. I had modeled it. And in that quiet Sunday light, he finally understood that the contract he believed shielded him had simply equalized the field. People often assume that moments like that end marriages instantly. They don't. What they end is an illusion. After that Sunday afternoon, Daniel moved differently around me. Not fearfully, not resentfully, carefully. He reread the agreement on his own, consulted advisors, spent longer hours in his office. I didn't interfere. I didn't monitor. I didn't pursue. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't stabilizing his reaction. I was simply standing still. The dynamic between us shifted into something unfamiliar, not hostility, but symmetry. He began asking for my opinion without framing it as a sanity check. He introduced me in public as my wife, who understands valuation better than most of us in this room. It sounded different now, not performative, measured. Whether it was respect, recalibration, or self-preservation, I didn't dissect it, because something more important had already happened internally. I no longer needed him to see my competence for it to exist. For years, part of my identity had been built around an invisible contribution, quiet correction, emotional moderation. Now my identity felt detached from his narrative entirely. If we divorced, I would not be destabilized. If we stayed married, it would not be under illusion. That knowledge changes posture. I noticed it in small ways. The way I entered rooms, the way I spoke in meetings, the way I answered questions was without minimizing my expertise. At work, I accepted a promotion that required more visibility, more authorship, fewer background roles. Daniel congratulated me sincerely. There was no bitterness in me. That surprised me more than anything. I didn't want to punish him. I didn't want to win. I wanted equilibrium. The prenup had never been about money. It had been about acknowledgement, about understanding that contribution carries weight, even when delivered quietly. One evening, months after the confrontation, Daniel and I sat on the balcony overlooking the city. We were operating on different assumptions, he said thoughtfully. Yes, I replied. I thought control meant initiating, he admitted. And I thought patience meant loyalty, I said. We both let that sit between us. We are still married as I tell this story. Not because I feared leaving, not because he feared losing, but because once the illusion dissolved, choice became clearer. Who I am now is not the woman who absorbs forecasts, not the stabilizer in someone else's ambition. I am someone who reads the architecture of her own life carefully and ensures her name is on the foundation. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about understanding structure so well that you never have to raise your voice. And once you experience that kind of clarity, you cannot return to invisibility. When Daniel once said divorce was inevitable, he believed he was forecasting power. What he didn't understand is that inevitability is neutral. It doesn't belong to the person who says it first. It belongs to the person who understands it best. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't respond with panic. I responded with preparation. And when the time came, I used our financial agreement as the shock he never saw coming. Not to wound him, not to humiliate him, but to rebalance a narrative that had quietly tilted for years. There's a lesson here that has nothing to do with money. Contracts matter, yes. Timing matters, absolutely. But what matters most is authorship. For a long time, I allowed myself to be edited out of our shared story, softened into support, simplified into grounded, reframed as steady. None of those words were insults, but they were incomplete. The quietest form of power is not dominance over someone else. It's clarity about your own value, written, documented, and understood long before you need to defend it. Many women are taught that composure is compliance. It isn't. Silence can be fear, but it can also be a strategy. The difference is intention. If you are being underestimated, ask yourself something simple. Are you staying quiet because you're unsure of your worth, or because you're still preparing to define it properly? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't burn anything down. I simply read the agreement carefully. And sometimes that's enough. So tell me, have you ever realized too late that someone had already written a narrative about you without your input? And if you did, would you rewrite it quietly or confront it loudly?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.